Hi everybody, I hope this video finds you well. In today's video, we're going to take some time to look at some motivating examples for our course. The point of these motivating examples is to help you guys get a little bit of a better understanding of exactly what statistics is, some interesting moments in statistics, as well as to have a better sense of what the science of statistics really is all about. These motivating examples, I've picked out just over a couple different random periods of time and different sort of interesting moments where a sort of question that related to statistics made it into the news or is historically sort of significant. We're not going to be talking about any sort of computations here or strict definitions just yet. I just wanted to give you guys some little examples to really give you a sense of this type of thinking that often occurs in statistics. So let's take a look at our first example. It comes a little bit out of left field perhaps, but we're going to talk a little bit about advertisements. And specifically, we're going to talk about Colgate toothpaste ads from the United Kingdom in around about 2007. So, in 2006-2007, in the United Kingdom, Colgate toothpaste was running an ad campaign that centered around an advertisement that read, 80% of dentists recommend Colgate. This was an ad campaign that they put up on billboards, they had on sides of buses, at benches, things like that. This was all over the place, and it was a big ad campaign for them. Of course, that advertisement, 80% of dentists recommend Colgate, is a pretty strong recommendation, and that's why they were using it as their advertisement. Now, in the United Kingdom, there is a sort of agency that is responsible for investigating advertisements and making sure that they're truthful. It's called the Advertising Standards Authority. So this Colgate ad was investigated by the Advertising Standards Authority, ASA, and they were found to be running what is considered a false advertisement. So the ad was banned, they weren't allowed to run the ad anymore, and Colgate was forced to pay for the removal of all the ads. They had to take everything down, and they were fined in general for running a false advertisement. So the question is, why? Right? Now, we can immediately think of some possible explanations. And the first one that I've detailed here, this is what everyone should immediately think of. Maybe they just had no data to back up this claim. Maybe they just said, let's pick 80% because it's a number that doesn't sound too high, so people won't believe it, but it sounds high enough that it makes us look really good. Or perhaps they had data, but they just made it up, right? They made up some fake dentists, or they just took real dentists, but then they never talked to them. They just wrote down their own responses. So maybe they had no data to back up the claim, or perhaps the data was faked. And of course, in looking at data, these are always concerns. Now, I will just say that in general, this type of concern about the data just being incorrect is really not something we're going to spend a lot of time with in our class. We're going to more focus on, even if the data is correct, what can be some things that go wrong. And actually, in this situation, Colgate was not just making this up, nor had they faked the data in any way. So while this is a possible explanation and certainly something we need to be worried about in real life, this was not the explanation in this situation. So the second thing is, maybe the data was real, so maybe they really did contact real dentists, but perhaps the data wasn't as honest as you would want. Perhaps they had persuaded the dentist to answer a certain way, and we would call that incentives. So you can imagine if you were a dentist and you received a survey or something from Colgate that maybe promised you some money or some other type of thing if you answered the survey in a certain way, then certainly that wouldn't be valid data. So maybe again the data was real, but maybe they had sort of biased the dentist in a certain way by giving them incentives or even just encouraging them to answer in a particular manner. So this of course is a very real sort of issue because the data would appear to be good, but then when we really think about it, well, if you're paying people to answer one way, then the answers they give are pretty much meaningless. So while this is certainly a concern, and we'll talk a little bit more about the dangers of incentives and also how surveys can use incentives to get good data as long as the incentives are not tied to particular responses, this turned out not to be the reason they were investigated. So it's a good thing to think about in terms of surveys, but it wasn't the problem here. Finally, the third possible explanation, that's sort of a weird one, but you got to think about it, is maybe the data was real, so they didn't fake it, they didn't just make it up, and maybe they didn't persuade people to answer a certain way, but maybe it was a very small sample size. After all, if you asked 5 people and 4 of them said that they recommend Colgate, that's 80%. Maybe you just cut the study there and say, okay, 4 out of 5, good enough. right? Now, of course, we've heard probably over and over in our modern day life the dangers of talking about a small sample size and trying to extend a small sample size out to the general population. So, of course, if this was an issue, you can see why they might get sort of investigated. 4 out of 5 is 80% mathematically, but you wouldn't run that saying 80% of all dentists. So this is, of course, a real concern, and as we go further into our study of statistics, we'll definitely talk about the issues that can arise when you have really small samples. But it turned out they didn't have a very small sample size. They actually had a really good study. So actually, in this situation, the data was from an independent third-party source, so this sort of removed this issue here. The sample was large, so that removed that here. And the dentists were not affiliated or compensated by Colgate in any way, so again, nothing about that. So all 3 of these are possible explanations how you could sort of have bad data, but in this case, all of these were not really the issue. So we might think then, why did they get investigated? What was the problem? Well, the real problem was that the survey question was written similarly to what I've written here. Now, it's not exactly the same. I'm taking a little bit of a liberty here, but this is sort of generally what it looked like. So the question that the dentist sort of received is, it said, as a dentist, which of the following brands of toothpaste do you recommend? Check all that apply. And I listed a few here: Colgate, Crest, Sensodyne, Arm & Hammer, Tom's, and then they probably had a bunch more British brands, all different types, maybe 10, 20 different brands that the dentist could recommend. So what's the issue with this here? Well, if you look at this question, the issue was not about sort of, how they decided to choose the dentist, or if they were paying them, or if they were making up the data, but it was actually about the question they asked here. And really the issue came in right here, the check all that apply. If you think about it, if you were a dentist answering this question, or even if you were just a normal person answering this question, right? If you don't have a strong opinion, what you're probably going to recommend is you're going to say, sure, I recommend Colgate and Crest and Sensodyne, Arm & Hammer, Tom, sure, everything. Most dentists are probably going to recommend toothpaste. The thing that the ASA was concerned about was that how the ad was phrased. So the issue that the ASA was raising about the Colgate ad was not that the data was incorrect, but it was about how it was interpreted. The ASA believed that when a person reads 80% of dentists recommend Colgate, we naturally infer that it means they recommend Colgate over other brands. When you hear 80% of dentists recommend Colgate, your brain sort of implicitly fills in that they recommend it over the other brands. In other words, they're choosing Colgate instead of other brands. But that, of course, is not what the question asked. When people were picking Colgate here, they could have been picking all of the other forms of toothpaste as well. They weren't picking it as their only choice above the others. So this was what the real concern was. The ASA actually ruled that if Colgate wanted to run an advertisement like the one they tried to run, their survey question needed to ask dentists to choose a single brand to recommend, aka like a favorite or top brand. So rewrite this question as something that said, as a dentist, which of the following brands is your top recommendation or is your favorite to recommend? And then, of course, it would say check only one. Now, if they had written the question like that, the ASA had decided that then they could have run their advertisement. Of course, if they had written the question like that, they most likely wouldn't have gotten 80% of the votes, right? The idea was that by phrasing it like this, they got a very high percentage. But if they had phrased it as which is your favorite, their percentage would have been much lower and the advertisement wouldn't have looked as good. So why are we talking about this? Well, for a couple reasons. One is it shows the intersection of something like statistics with a field that might seem very different, like advertisement, but also a field that might seem different, like law, right? This was an intersection of advertising, legal precedent, as well as statistics here. In fact, there was also, in the court case that the ASA actually held here, there was also a little bit of psychology involved in this, because this thing here about saying that they naturally infer, they actually talked to psychologists about whether or not that's true. Do people's brains implicitly infer that when you say you recommend something, you recommend it over others? And psychologists did say, yes, that is how the human brain generally works. But for us, the real conclusion I want to draw from you to here is that the way that you phrase a question, or more generally, in the way you collect your data, impacts the type of conclusions you can make in statistics. The reason I'm really calling your guys' attention to this is because there's nothing wrong with the data. There's nothing wrong with the way they conducted their study. The thing that happened that's wrong here is how they went from their data to their conclusion. If they had phrased it as 80% of dentists recommend Colgate along with other brands, they would have been fine. If they had phrased the question as here's the percentage of people who only chose Colgate and changed the percentage to be corresponding to that, they would have been fine. But the big thing that we're going to have to be so careful with in our class is making sure that we understand that the way we collect the data, the way we phrase a question that helps us collect our data, really impacts the type of conclusion we can make. Okay, let's investigate this in a completely different light, but again with this focus on the connection between data and conclusions. So our second example, we're going to change gears quite a bit, and we're going to talk about a very famous mathematician, and really in some ways the sort of one of the founding fathers of statistics as we know it today. His name is Abraham Wald, and we're going to talk about his work with World War II bomber planes in about 1943 to 1944, even into 1945. So, as many of you guys probably know, during World War II, the Allied forces undertook a massive bombing campaign, flying planes from Allied-controlled areas like Great Britain into Germany. Of course, these bombing runs were not just done freely, they were not done without resistance. And a major question that sort of arose in the sort of military circles was how to better design or armor the bomber planes to protect them against anti-aircraft fire. When they were flying these bomber planes into these occupied areas, right, they were getting shot at, and to protect the lives of the pilots, but also to make sure that the machines were actually able to accomplish their strategic missions, you wanted them to be as protected as possible. Of course, the question here is trickier by the fact that only a limited amount of sort of structural reinforcement or armor or plating could be added, since the planes need to get off the ground. I mean, they're planes, they have to fly. So you can't just put the plane in a steel box and hope that it's still going to be able to fly. So you sort of have a balancing act here. You want to add additional armor, reinforced plating, those types of things, but you also still need to have it be able to fly. And to be honest, it wasn't just about getting off the ground. They had to have a reasonable fuel efficiency to make their runs, which might have been, across like the English Channel or something like that, and then still return. So, to analyze this, they brought in a mathematician, Abraham Wald, and he started by collecting as much data as he could. In general, statistics has always had this sort of relationship with data that says if you can get the more of it, the better, right? If you just collect as much data, then hopefully you can make some good decisions off of that. So he had his assistants look at every bomber that they could that returned from its journey and chart out the bullet holes and other damage on the plane. And then they took all that information, they put them onto schematics of the plane, and they overlaid all of these to create what we nowadays would call a heat map, basically showing the most frequently hit or damaged locations. So they got a diagram similar to this one here. So you can see there's the sort of schematic of the plane, and then, maybe an individual plane had shots here, 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 and then another one had hits here, 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 and then another one had here, 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 here. And if you overlaid all those together, you got sort of one composite picture where the sort of more dots there were in a certain area, that means the more likely amongst all of the planes you were finding those sort of damaged spots or those bullet holes. So this was sort of his final project after collecting all of the data from the assistants, right? They sort of had this one master diagram that showed the most frequently hit or damaged places on these bomber planes. So remember that here the red dots represent the places that were hit the most frequently. So you can see places like this, 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 and this were all very commonly hit in the planes that they were studying. So the question, of course, is where should the extra armor be added? Well, the military looked over Wald's data and decided that the places that were hit the most frequently, i.e. had the most red dots, were the reasonable areas to add extra armor. So when the military advisors looked at this, they said, well, if this place gets shot a lot, and this place gets shot a lot, and this one, let's put extra armor here, 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 to block those shots that we know are very frequent, right? And it's basically saying if you have a shield and you're trying to block something, you should try to put the shield in places that you know there's the most shots. That was the sort of logic they used there. Notice that that's a very simple logical structure that shows that relationship between if we have lots of data, if this is where lots of planes get shot, then that must be where we want to put our extra armor. Wald thought about things a little bit differently, though. Wald disagreed. He reasoned that actually the places that had no or very few red dots were the ones that needed additional armor. So when he looked at this diagram, he said we should be concerned about a place like that, a place like that, a place like that, here, here, here. Any place that didn't have a lot of dots, didn't show a lot of damage, those were the places to be concerned about. And of course, when he made that sort of statement or made that conclusion, he got a lot of pushback because that's not what the sort of obvious conclusion from the data was. So let's talk a little bit about his logic. So, why did he come to this conclusion? Well, he used two key pieces of reasoning. First, he reasoned that anti-aircraft fire should be random. In other words, if you're trying to shoot at a plane that's flying through the sky, you're just shooting up in its general vicinity. The actual spots you're going to be hitting are probably going to be pretty random, meaning that all spots on the plane should be equally likely to be hit. In other words, you're just sort of shooting as close as you can to the plane. You're not aiming at a specific spot on the plane. It's way up in the sky. You're down on the ground. It should be pretty random. The second thing to his reasoning, and this is the really key piece, is that he realized he was getting a limited set of data, the planes that returned. When he and his assistants were analyzing where the planes had been shot, they were only looking at the planes that successfully made their run, perhaps took some fire, and then still were able to return back to base. Wald realized that his data set was skewed to the planes that took fire but survived. What he basically realized then is that the places without red dots were places that if the plane was hit, then it would not survive. So again, just to sort of explain these two pieces of reasoning, his idea was that overall, we should expect dots everywhere. That's what it means for this anti-aircraft fire to be random. We should see dots everywhere. The fact that we're not seeing dots in these places must mean that when those places are hit, the plane doesn't make it back. In other words, the plane was not part of his data. So, this was a huge logical jump, obviously. Especially at the time. Nowadays, and we'll talk about this when we get into statistical biases a little bit later in our course, we actually know this as what is called survivorship bias, where you only get data from the objects or the people or whatever that survive something. So you're only getting a limited set of data. Now, another sort of interesting component to this was that the military looked at his data, made one conclusion. He disagreed and made a separate conclusion. To confirm his theory, right, to confirm that logical jump that he was confident in but wanted confirmation of, what he did is he had the engineers study each spot that lacked red dots in his diagram. In other words, he made a prediction about which locations would be very dangerous if they were damaged, and then had somebody actually check those locations. What the engineers found is that uniformly, every spot that Wald indicated housed something that, if damaged, would cause the plane to crash, be destroyed, or simply not be able to make the return journey. That validated his theory. And this right here, this is a really important idea in applied statistics. A lot of times we use applied statistics to sort of narrow down our range of guesses or our range of estimates. And then we let experts in the field, in this case, engineers who could actually go and take apart the planes, check those more limited guesses. Now you might say, well, why not have the engineer check everywhere? Well, it doesn't really work that way because an engineer, when they look at it, is going to say, well, if any of these things break, the plane is in trouble. But by having this sort of lens, this sort of microscope to pick out very certain spots, all these ones that his data indicated, then they could really emphasize, put their attention on them, and confirm his theory. That's what really happened here. And that's the synergy between sort of a prediction in statistics and a confirmation by somebody actually in that field. All right, so what's the conclusion here? Why are we talking about this? What should we take away from it? Well, we got to remember that sometimes the data we have access to is limited. right? If that is the case, we have to be very careful about how we interpret our results, and sometimes this involves making use of some clever logic. If you think about these first two examples, the first example, we sort of self-limited, right? Or at least the people who created the Colgate survey self-limited. They chose to phrase the question one way, and that limited how you could make a conclusion from that data. Here, there was nobody saying that we want to only look at the planes that return. It was a necessity. The only data that this Abraham Wald had access to was the planes that survived. So he had no choice in that. He wasn't phrasing the question in a particular way or saying, I only want to look at the planes that return. That was all that he had access to. But that meant he still had to be very careful about how he came to his conclusions. And in fact, to make a conclusion about that actually applied to all planes that was actually useful, he actually had to make a very clever logical jump, recognizing by putting together his two pieces of information that it was actually the places that didn't demonstrate damage that needed to be more protected. Okay, so these are two sort of historical examples. I mean, this one is historically very significant in modern statistics, mainly because Wald himself was very significant in modern statistics even after this, and it's also sort of just a famous sort of historical example. The Colgate ad, I'm not going to claim is nearly as historically significant, but I think it still serves an important purpose of helping you guys understand this connection between data and conclusions. Let's talk about a very recent example that sort of ties all this together. So, our last sort of example is we're going to talk about discriminatory lending practices. And this actually comes from the US just a few years ago, back in 2016. So, in the United States, we have something called the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which is often abbreviated CFPB. Basically, they are tasked with protecting consumers in financial situations, making sure that people are not suffering discrimination in financial practices. So they launched in 2016 an investigation into discriminatory lending practices, specifically dealing with loans for purchasing vehicles. So they were looking at companies that offered people loans when trying to purchase a vehicle. Now, terms of a loan can be based on a lot of information. There's a lot of stuff that goes into determining whether or not you get a loan and what sort of interest rate you need to pay on a loan. The pieces of information that are often used are things like your credit history, your bank statements, how much money do you currently have in the bank, your payoff history on other loans or other sort of financial responsibilities, and income verification. How much money are you taking in? How stable is that job? So on and so forth. Legally, however, loans cannot be based on non-financial information, pretty much anything else. Things like your age, your gender, your creed or your religion, your ethnicity, those cannot be used to determine whether or not you should get a loan or whether or not what interest rate you should get if you do get a loan. So you can use financial information, you pretty much can't use anything else. The problem, however, from a regulatory perspective is how, say for something like ethnicity, which is what we're going to talk about here, how can you actually detect potential discrimination? Well, you might say, well, we can just simply analyze. We can see if people of a certain ethnicity or race maybe get better interest rates or worse interest rates or get approved more frequently or get denied more frequently. Why can't we just do that? Well, the problem is that when you fill out a loan document, you certainly provide information like your name, your address, all of that financial information I just listed up there, but you don't write down your ethnicity. That's not part of a standard financial form. You don't mark, if you're white or African American or Hispanic or Asian American, you don't put any of that down on the form. So that means that a regulatory agency like the CFPB has a very hard time to go back and see if there's any discrimination because that piece of data is just completely missing. You have the information about whether or not they were approved or denied the loan, but you don't know what ethnicity or race they were. So it is very hard to tell if a particular race or ethnicity is being discriminated against when you don't have that data. Now, one option is you could, of course, employ manually people to go out, seek out these people, and confirm directly what their ethnicity is, and then look at whether or not they were approved and denied and analyze it that way. The problem is, as you can imagine, that is a massive project in terms of man hours. You'd have to go, locate each of these individuals, figure out their ethnicity, confirm that with them directly, and then you could begin your analysis. That's just not feasible when we're talking about tens of thousands of loans that go through a single institution. So, the CFPB used an approach that came from a statistician based here in Santa Monica from the RAND think tank. His name is Mark Elliott, and basically he developed a formula that attempts to infer racial data based on the basic information that's found on a form like a loan document. So the question that we're interested in is, how does he predict or make a reasonable guess at that missing information? Well, let's talk a little bit about that. So, Elliotts Formula is based around an idea we're going to actually study in our course. Now, we won't get nearly as advanced as some of his work is, but the core idea is something we'll cover. It's called Conditional Probability, and we'll see it towards the middle of our class. So, let's imagine you're trying to guess someone's race without any information. So, in other words, there's maybe a person in another room, you can't see them, you can't talk to them, you don't get any information about them, and maybe you're asked to guess their ethnicity or their race. Well, the most basic and simple way you could do it is base it off the just general percentage breakdown for the U.S. If you know this person is from the United States, well, we have a rough ethnic breakdown of the United States that's provided by things like the census. Recent data, of course, right now we're in the middle of a census year in 2020 right now, so these things might change, but recently, back in 2019, there were some estimates based off the 2016 census as well as some other information. Recent data, and again, this is a rough approximation, says that about 60% of the United States identifies as white, 19% Hispanic, 13% African American, 6% Asian American, and about 2% other. So in other words, if you were guessing the race or ethnicity of this person that you had no information about, this would be your guess. You'd say, well, there's about a 60% chance they're white, 19% Hispanic, 13% African American, 6% Asian, and 2% something else, because that's the breakdown for people who live in the U.S. So if the only piece of information we have is that they're from the U.S., that would be sort of our distribution for our guess. But we do have a bit more information, or at least the CFPB and this formula from Mark Elliott does have a bit more information. They have the information from the loan form. Elliott's formula makes use of what is called Bayesian improved surname geocoding, which is a very fancy name, but it's a very complicated formula, but its core approach is very simple. It's basically based on these two pieces of information. The first thing that the formula makes use of is last name or surname. Certain last names, as we can imagine, are very likely to be associated with certain races, and information about this is widely available. When people are born, last name and birth certificates are recorded, so we have very good information about the connection between last name or surname and ethnicity. So this approach turned out to have a very high accuracy for identifying Hispanic and Asian Americans. There's some very sort of specialized last names that are associated with each ethnic group. But it turned out it wasn't very useful for sort of separating or identifying white and African Americans who often share many common last names. So the second part of the formula, that's the surname aspect. The second part was geocoding. So the second part basically tries to do a more advanced version of what we discussed here. There's racial breakdowns by neighborhood and zip code that are available. Remember that on a loan form, a person does provide their address. So during each major census, not only do we get an ethnic breakdown for the country, we get these percentages for the country and for the states, but we also get them calculated for each zip code. So, by putting those pieces of information together, in other words, if we know the percentage breakdown of different ethnicities in your particular neighborhood or zip code, and we know information about your last name, you can have a lot of accuracy for guessing somebody's ethnicity. So, in other words, this formula improves the accuracy by stating that if you have a last name that is common for one major racial group, and you live in an area where that racial group is common, then you are more likely to be of that racial group. That's the sort of logic there. Now, like I said, this formula is much more complex than what we're dealing here, but I wanted to give you guys a basic sense of it. It uses many other factors that are also based on the basic information you find in a loan form, such as age and gender. For example, for gender, it turns out that things like your surname are less useful when looking at females rather than males and trying to classify. That's of course because in certain traditions, right, women take last names after being married in certain situations, so that can actually weaken the surname sort of accuracy, and you can sort of account for that. There's also issues sometimes with age. More recently, right, there's a lot more sort of interracial, interethnicity marriages that occur. So you get maybe more individuals that don't fit according, again, to that surname sort of idea, or perhaps even from the geocoding, if one person marries into a particular racial or ethnic group and then moves to an area that's dominated by that group, then suddenly wouldn't fit the statistics as well. So there's many ways where these things are not just a simple immediate guess, but there's also ways to correct for those that these statisticians used. It turned out that with this, they got pretty good accuracy. They did do some confirmation cases. In other words, they would make a prediction using this formula, and then they would actually go find that person and confirm, and they did find a good level of accuracy there. The CFPB used this formula to check over tens of thousands of loan documents. So in other words, the CFPB took this formula, generated the probable ethnicity for many customers, and then cross-referenced it against whether or not they were approved or denied for loans. So this was allowing them to analyze very quickly whether or not there was potential discrimination. They actually did find evidence of discrimination from some lenders, and this was actually brought to court. So once again, we have a very interesting sort of intersection between statistics, data, and legality. The U.S. court system was actually poised to make a large-scale decision about the admissibility of statistical evidence. In other words, there was going to be a really important decision made here about whether or not statistical evidence like this, remember, this formula is making a prediction, a guess. It's not an automatic fact. So whether or not that's legally acceptable was a big question to be decided by the courts. But unfortunately, recent legislation has weakened the CFPB in terms of its regulatory powers, and ultimately, this case was never ruled on. So while they were able to use the formula to analyze what they believed was potential discrimination, of course, the company said it was not discrimination and the formula is incorrect. The courts were ready to make a decision about whether or not it was legally admissible, but due to some legislation, that never actually got to be finished as a court case. So we're still waiting in the U.S. for a major landmark decision about statistics and legal admissibility. It's probably going to happen relatively soon. Statistics and data is becoming so much more frequently used and more common in all sort of places that eventually we're going to see a court case that decides whether or not we believe it's legally binding. What's the sort of conclusion for us, though, from this? Well, the main idea here is that in certain situations, there's just some data that is simply inaccessible on a large scale. Something like, this data on ethnicity for loan forms. Like we said, you could send people out and manually find out this ethnicity information, but it's just not feasible in terms of a sort of amount of time and labor that would be committed to it. So statisticians often have to infer or predict this data from other data. So why do we have these three examples as our motivating examples? Well, one is just to show you a diverse range of situations where statistics occurs, but the real thing, and this is going to be really what we start with when we start to lay out the basic definitions of statistics in our next video, is that you'll notice that the most common word, the thing we keep saying over and over in statistics, is data. All of these three examples hinge on some interesting thing happening with the data. In the first, it was about how the data was collected. The second was about the access that was available to the data, the missing data. And this third one was about how to generate data from other data, how to build more data based on the data that we actually have. So everything in statistics hinges on this concept of data. And as we'll see, statistics itself, when we define it, is truly the science of data. So I hope that these examples sort of motivate you guys in the sense that statistics can be applied in a whole variety of fields and can have really far-ranging sort of impacts, and the decisions that can happen from statistics can affect a lot of different aspects of our life. In our next video, we'll start into the basic terminology of statistics and start building a shared language to be able to speak about statistics, data, and the conclusions we're trying to make.